Members, that concludes item 5, local board input. Public input. Under 6, local board input, we have none. There is nothing called to my attention under extraordinary items, so now we will go to item 8. And item 8 is on page 13 of your agenda. And this item relates to the resolutions of the Aotea, Great Barrier and Waiheke and Waitemata local boards regarding their concerns about helicopter activity in their areas. Members, there's been quite a lot of discussion with the respective board chairs and deputy. Myself and Councillor Coombe have been involved with discussions with Izzy Fordham at Aotea and Kath Hanley at Waiheke and at Waitemata with Alex Bonham, the Deputy Chair, along with our staff over some months on this. And you can see some, I'll put the so-called Chair's Recs, but these recommendations have been worked up with Councillor Coombe, our staff, and the respective chairs and deputies that I've just mentioned. So I'll move those. Councillor Coombe, thank you.
Thank you.
And so it's moved and seconded, so we'll have that on the screen. So primarily the issue before us is to respond to the resolutions of the respective boards, and we have that paper before us now. And the manager of Planning Northwest is the lead on this, Warren McLennan, supported by Peter Vari, and we also have staff from our regulatory team, and I want to acknowledge the role here too of Councillor Cooper, because this is not just exclusively a planning matter, it crosses over into the regulatory area, and I'll hear from Councillor Cooper shortly as well. So now handing to Warren McLennan. Kia ora, Warren. And look, I just want to acknowledge, I think on the call we do have Kath Hanley, Izzy Fordham and Alex Bonham that are with us for this item as well. Warren, in your hands.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, councillors. I'll just go through a brief presentation, and then we're happy to take questions. So, as the Chair said, we do have Peter Vari along in terms of some of the district planning provisions. Brad Allen, I think, from Resource Consents, and our monitoring and compliance team headed by Adrian Wilson. So there's a variety of people that can answer questions along the way. Next slide, please. So each of the 3 local boards, as Chair Darby has said, have passed resolutions relating to concerns around helicopter management, and they go back. Certainly the Waiheke local board have been involved in this for much of last year, and then we also had the Waitemata local board and Aotea Great Barrier local board. So there are three similar sorts of or 3 boards with similar sorts of concerns, although slightly different according to the plans which have jurisdiction in those areas. And the 3 local board representatives made presentations last month to the Planning Committee. And you also have the full resolutions attached to your report as resolutions B, C and D. So that's all set out there. Next slide, please. So the regulatory framework is set out there, in particular for the Unitary plan for residential zones. Helicopter landing and takeoff is a non-complying activity. And in particular, that means that a full notification assessment applies to helicopter activities which are discretionary or non-compliant. It's a slightly different pattern in the Hauraki Gulf Islands, and in particular, helicopter activities particularly over residential areas, are subject to, well, they're restricted discretionary, and so they're subject to compliance with various matters, which includes noise limits. Notification there is also different to the Auckland Unitary Plan. The HGI plan has, it's the restricted discretionary activity applications have a non-notification clause, which generally precludes notification unless there are special circumstances. And that's the area that we will be wanting to concentrate on as we go through this investigation. So next slide, please. So although, as I've just said, the Hauraki Gulf Islands provisions are less strict, the effects are able to be considered, and you can assess the relevance of effects and allow for applications to be declined. So the matters of discretion are pretty much visual and oral amenity, and it particularly relates to the helipad rather than the flight itself. So you'll see the relevant assessment criteria, helipad locations, flight numbers, flight movements, and cumulative effects. But notification is, as I've said, there are limitations on our ability to consider special circumstances there, and in particular, the amenity effects and cultural effects are more problematic to be able to be covered, and that is also part of the investigation to be addressed. Next slide, please. So if we go on to look at the resolutions passed by the 3 local boards, this is really a bit of a summary of what various boards have asked for, not all the same, but there's a detailed discussion of these within the report. So there's a request for the plan change, for a plan change to, in the Unitary plan, to apply prohibited activity status in residential zones and coastal areas. Now that prohibition one is a pretty difficult one for us to defend. It's so clearly that's part of the investigation, but it's not something that we see as being easy at all. The request for declaration from the Environment Court, we think the provisions are clear and we're not planning to do that at the time. The request for all helipad applications to be publicly notified using special circumstances, and really that needs, through the wording of the plan change, of the plan itself, it needs a case-by-case consideration. The next one around a moratorium on helicopter applications, and that's similar to the first request. Again, that's not provided for under the Resource Management Act, and so therefore we have to look at how we can investigate the need or otherwise for tighter controls through this process. The next one, request for a plan change to the Hauraki Gulf Islands plan, and there is also a request for a change to the Unitary plan, and that's the evidence that we're looking to gather at the moment, which is set out in the recommendations, and so we've already started this work, and we can talk about exactly what is happening in there when we get to the recommendations. Finally, the Aotea Great Barrier local board have particularly asked council staff to continue with working with mana whenua on sites of significance, and the next tranche is being worked on at the moment, and there will be another tranche later on in the year. and so that will continue work on sites of significance. Last slide, please. So the resource consents part of the request for resource consents to review their helicopter practice and guidance note, that work is happening at the moment, and it's nearly complete, and I'm sure that Brad or Ian will be able to talk about that. The compliance and monitoring project has already commenced. The letters have been sent to all of the consent holders. I think some replies have been received. Starting the analysis of flight log information, and then there will be a time to determine the extent of that compliance. I think the monitoring team have also met with Quiet Skies, and they're continuing to work with Civil Aviation Authority, and that work will continue, and we'll have those findings reported back to the Planning Committee together with the options for going ahead. Thanks, Kalinda.
Thank you, Warren.
Maybe we could go to the recommendations.
Sorry, say again, Warren.
I'd just say maybe we should go to the recommendations.
Okay, we'll go to the recommendations. Do you want to take us through the recommendations then that reflect the discussion that we've had with the respective board chairs and deputies with yourself, your team and Councillor Coombe over the last couple of months?
Yes, certainly. So we do acknowledge concerns raised by the 3 local boards and Mana Whenua, and that was from the Aotea local board itself, putting together a petition and so on. And the let me see. So the number C, the compliance and monitoring department, doing this work. I've covered that. So we are working with the CAA. I think that Adrian's already had meetings with them, and I think that continues tomorrow. I also think the Waiheke local board and Quiet Skies have been working with CAA as well. So the overview, so the work will cover the current and historic levels of pattern of activity, and as you see there, a report prepared for the Planning Committee together with an assessment of the options available to address helicopter activity in the Auckland region. So that's the work that we're doing. I've talked about the resource consents practice and guidance note, almost done, and I've talked about the issue around prohibited activity status, which is a difficult one to establish, and so we haven't recommended that. You'll all note that you'll all be aware of the Planes and Places and a large part of the rest of the council and councillors working through the NPSUD and the Housing Supply Act. So we're really looking to enable the time over the next few months, 6 months, to get that work out of the way, or at least on a further level of activity, and for the monitoring department to work on the detail of this in the meantime. And I've also noted the sites of significance work to Mana Whenua on Aotea Great Barrier Island.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that summary. And now you've commenced the work under the C, that's highlighted, and the practice and guidance note is underway. And I understand today the Civil Aviation Authority are visiting Waiheke. Is your team party that to their visit there, or is that just with the Waiheke board and the CAA themselves?
I think that it's, maybe Kath is on the line. I'm not sure.
We can't go to Kath right now. I'm sorry, Warren, but look, Kath I'll go to you briefly, Kath. Kath, you are with us. You've got the Civil Aviation Authority visiting Waiheke today and visiting you.
Yes, it was scheduled, but because of COVID in one of their households, it is now going to be the 31st of May. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Kath, for that clarification. So that work is underway as well. Again, a little bit delayed with good reason. Okay, Warren, we've got the recommendations here. We'll take some questions, and the first question is from Independent Māori Statutory Board Member Tau Henare. Kia ora, Tau.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Chair. Warren, just a couple of questions around engagement with mana whenua. Who specifically are we talking about when I see mana whenua come up on the recommendations?
No. To date, this has really been through the Aotea Great Barrier Local Board, which provided us with a letter from Ngāti Rehua Ngāti Wai ki Aotea, and that was Charles Nephier. So we'll be talking with him in particular, but we'll also be raising it with other mana whenua groups, particularly on Waiheke.
Just in regards to your presentation, I didn't see a mention of the health and safety issue around increased helicopter activity. Is that something that civil aviation is looking at, or are you looking at that as well?
It will be considered as part of the report, but that will be work that we receive, or information that we receive from the Civil Aviation Authority. That's not necessarily, it's really more context for what changes, if any, we need to the Hauraki Gulf Islands plan or the Auckland Unitary plan.
Yeah, it's just interesting that the interesting part of that issue is that there seems to be a hell of an increase in activity over the past, say, even 12 months. And I would have thought that a deeper dive into the health and safety would have shone through in this report, but I'm happy that civil aviation will pick that up. Thank you, Warren.
Thanks.
Thank you, Member Henare. I will now go to the question of the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Warren. Just want absolute clarity, Warren, around urban flyovers by helicopters on the way to rural jobs. Is that going to be anything part of your work?
Well, certainly. So the work is really around helipads, and the responsibility for this council is around the landing and taking off at helipads. So overflying, if they're more than 500 feet, becomes a CAA responsibility.
Thanks for the clarification.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And the next call is with Independent Māori Statutory Board Member Karen Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Warren, for that. A lot of complexity there, as we know. My question, I've got a couple of questions. Given that we know there would be urgency to try and safeguard sites of significance on Aotea from helicopter activity, it doesn't wait while everyone goes through the investigation. Have you considered what interim measures can be taken to ensure these sites are not adversely impacted while the council goes through its assessments and formal scheduling processes? That's my first question.
Okay, so that's resource consent question, probably. Brad, can you answer that? I mean, I think the answer is partly that while there are 5 applications that have been made to Great Barrier, only one has been approved, I think. But Brad, could you give us an update on that?
Kia ora, Brad.
Kia ora, can you hear me?
We're with you,
Kia
Brad.
ora.
Yeah. So on Aotea, there's been 5 applications, 3 have been approved and 2 are still in process. The matters for discretion for the consents that have gone through so far have been restricted, so there hasn't been scope in terms of what the plan says that we can look at. And then in terms of the processing, we are restricted by the matters of discretion as they are in the plan at the moment. So until such time as there was a plan change or notified changes where there's legal effect for more matters to be brought in, there isn't scope at this stage.
So in essence, I'm understanding that to mean there are no measures going to be put in place, or whilst investigations are being carried out, they will continue on. Is that correct?
That's correct. At this stage, we are bound by the matters that we have in front of us at this stage until there is a formal change to allow us to broaden that out.
I would hope there is, because these could be drawn out for a long period of time. I hope there are some measures being looked at to mitigate whilst this investigation is being undertaken. It's taken over 2 years just to get another tranche into the heritage sites work. I think it's significantly important that some measures are taken to safeguard whilst this is taking place for the sites of significance. Have you any consideration there? Otherwise, Mr. Chair, I'd be looking at an amendment. It can't be that these will need to go through whilst an investigation is being undertaken.
Okay, go back to Brad. I think there was a question there of Brad first, and then we'll come back to the last part. Member Wilson, if you like.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of what we can consider at the moment, we have explored this, and legal advice is that we are still bound by the plan written matters of discretion. Obviously, where there are sites where there are sensitivities, we do try and liaise directly with an applicant to see if there are measures that we can persuade them into to account for those. But we are, at the end of the day, we are restricted to those matters of discretion and the scope of what is in the plan at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Member Wilson, you put something at the end there. You were concerned about something lacking that might require amendment. Member Wilson, do you mind just liaising with our Secretariat and key staff here? I will just make sure somebody contacts you. I just want to make sure that's covered off with you, unless you want to address it right now.
No, I'll make the contact with staff to see what that would look like, Mr. Chair. But I definitely think if an investigation acknowledges that sites of significance, because of the Māori Heritage Program, which hasn't yet progressed for a whole lot of different reasons, means there's a huge hole there that, if you're listening to the presenters, can't be covered as yet. That's not ideal. So I'll leave that there. And as you say, Mr. Chair, I just have one other question, if I can, for Warren.
Absolutely.
And that is there's things in there in terms of current legislation, policy environment, that says there's a lack of ability for staff to address things you'd normally have the ability to investigate options. I'm interested in the options part of how best to look at matters, including what I've just spoken to Brad about. There's got to be another way, and it can't be just because there is insufficient staff to address these problems which have significance for Māori and clearly for the local boards who are presenting it there. You have local boards, you have mana whenua that are united on matters that need to be looked at, but nothing legislatively that will help. Are there any options, Warren, that can be considered that acknowledges this is a significant matter clearly for local boards and for mana whenua. And I'm talking about in terms of the resource consents and potentially what sections could be used to acknowledge significance for mana whenua.
Warren, in your hands.
I think that a key part really is that in order to do a plan change, we really need to make sure that we have adequate information which will stand up through the hearings. When the Hauraki Gulf Islands plan was, and the helicopter provisions were agreed in about 2013, I think it was through a significant amount of opposition and argument and mediation between local people and helicopter companies and so on, tourism companies and so on. And it was really only settled through a lengthy appeal process. So we know that as we start any plan change process, we need to be well armed with information about what the issues are and the wording in any plan change that we would need to come up with to cover that. So that's why we're doing the investigation at the moment, and it will take some time, and it's worth it, I think, to get as good a plan change, as sound a plan change process as possible. In terms of the heritage work that the heritage team are doing on sites of significance, that is happening, I think, as far as I'm aware, tranche 2 is happening at the moment, and work is going on there. And a third tranche is being prepared for starting later in the year. But this is a resort, it's not just a resourcing thing of the council and staff. It's also a resourcing of ensuring that iwi are well informed and are supportive of any of these sites. And it's also important to ensure that the landowners are aware and work with the council on that. So that process of sites of significance plan changes does take a while.
And sorry, Mr. Chair, immediacy-wise, there's no plan in terms of immediacy as opposed to investigation and then?
So the sites of significance is a separate plan change, which the heritage team are working on at the moment. That's not part of the investigation because it is happening anyway. What we're looking at through this process are whether or not we need to change some of the provisions within the Hauraki Gulf Islands plan to allow, I guess, for a wider range of effects, including cultural effects, to be taken into account.
Thank you, Warren. I'll leave it there. Mr. Chair, just to advise our Secretariat, who's online, will be working with Kalinda in terms of what potentially could be proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wilson, and thank you, Warren. I'll now go to Councillor Coombe, please.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Ngā mihi, Warren and team. Thank you for the work that you're progressing. I have a few pārtai, if I may, Chair. Firstly, just to clarify in terms of, I know there's a lot of concern around the timetable for undertaking the investigation. So can you give us a better handle on that and when we can anticipate it coming back to the Planning Committee with the options?
Warren?
Well, so we're pretty early on in this, but I would say it's likely to take 3 to 4 months, maybe longer, to actually do the work to evaluate the resource consent conditions and compliance with them and work with CAA and so on. And when I say 3 or 4 months, there's still going to be some allowance for various other things which are out of our control, whether we can get further information, how much information we can get from CAA and so on. And then after that, the planning staff will put together a report which is looking at all the various options, and that may be a plan change. And if it is, then we'll come back to you to talk about the plan change itself. I'm guessing towards the end of the year, but I'm not sure. And some of this is, as we said in the report, some of the, I guess, priority resourcing that we need to put into other projects at the moment as well.
So can I just come in there, Councillor Kermit? And I know this is really important for you and your communities. Look, I'm very mindful, and I need to defend the staff here in terms of their workload. Their workload is enormous at the moment in responding to government directions, and that is our priority call, and we need to get that work over the line. And there's a lot more to do once our plan change for the National Policy Statement on Urban Development is notified in 20 August. So I think the chairs of the respective boards, the Deputy Chair of Waitemata, we are all aware of the priority of the Plans and Places unit and the regulatory unit. This is work that's going to be requiring the attention of both. So as your chair, I just want to make it very, very clear that there is other priority work that has to be above this right now, but we will get to it.
Thanks, Chair, but what I'm hearing is that this work is underway. So that's good news, and I'm not hearing from Warren that it is going to be delayed. It's just got to be stepped through. There's a process to follow. The investigation has to be undertaken, and then it's going to be looked at by the end of the year to be reported back. So is that right, Warren?
Yes. So what I'm trying to do here is to ensure that while Plans and Places keep to their key priorities, there is other investigation work happening which we don't have to be a part of, apart from catching up every now and then. But it's really important for us that the compliance team are working to look at these resource consent. We don't need to be there to do that. So you're correct that the work to be done in the compliance area and in the resource consents area can continue while we're doing this other work. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was wanting to clarify. And then also what you're saying, that we can look forward to this coming back to us by the end of the year if things go to plan. The other, of course, area of concern is very much what's happening with applications that council's currently receiving and how they're being dealt with. Will the practice note provide additional guidance, excuse me, particularly around where there is discretion to publicly notify applications?
Brad, that sounds like you.
Brad, are you still with us?
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, that's right. The practice note does go through essentially a step-by-step of the rules, what to assess, and different assessments that can be included for different application types in terms of their activity status. And it does cover off the notification aspects in terms of what needs to be considered for that.
Thank you. And when can we hope to see the practice note?
So it's been drafted. At the moment, it's going back to the author to have some changes made, and then it goes through council's approval process, which is through management sign-off, legal review, and my understanding is that that will also be public-facing as well once it's finalised.
Right, we look forward to that. And final part, if I may, Chair. Excuse me. The impact of noise is kind of a very live issue and being, I guess, reassessed in terms of international standards of best practice around noise and what people and environments can withstand around noise limits. Is that, where do you see that being looked at as part of this process that's underway, particularly perhaps in terms of the investigation around the impact of helicopter movements?
So within each resource consent, there are consent conditions relating to noise levels, and as far as I'm aware, the ones that are in there comply with all of the standards at the moment. And I guess the question will be whether those are adequate. But certainly, noise is a control within both plans.
Right. So if standards change kind of internationally as best practice, that's something we as Auckland Council can take into account on the way through.
I guess we would take the advice of the CAA on that, I think.
Right. Okay. And that's ongoing in terms of those conversations with CAA.
Yes, I think that the monitoring team have already met with the CAA and will continue.
Thank you. Appreciate the work that's underway. Kia ora, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Coombe. Just following up on the practice note then, Warren and Brad, does the practice note give any attention to how to assess an application where the application site is in proximity to a heliport? So I understand there's airports or heliports on Aotea and Waiheke, and in the Waitemata district there's Rosedale, there's Mechanics Bay, there's Onehunga. And then further out there's Ardmore and Auckland Airport and Dairy Flat. So when you get an application, probably this is your area, Brad, do you get to assess the availability of existing infrastructure?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this stage, the plan has it as a non-complying activity for those residential areas, which means that you end up back at the objectives and policies. And at this stage, my understanding is that there isn't much of a direction in terms of assessing the availability of other infrastructure in that regard. But in saying that, I will just cover off that there are some changes coming in through resource management considerations in terms of greenhouse gas and other aspects which have been raised, and those will be coming in and bring in a consideration of matters such as that. But at this stage, each application does need to be assessed on its own merits in terms of how it stacks up, and that doesn't sort of current planning policies and measures, it doesn't actually direct you to have that consideration, although it can be a consideration if it is relevant to the effects of that application.
Okay, and just following on for Councillor Coombe's question about noise, there's a little more than noise. I'm sure Councillor Coombe is aware of this, that you get it as a result of helicopter movement. You also get the effect of air displacement, impacts on ecology, impacts on recreational amenity, privacy, intrusion on that from an object dropping into the neighbouring site. So is all of that, can that all be taken into account under the current structure, whether it be in the non-complying or the restricted discretion, whether you're on the mainland or the islands?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the moment, for unitary plan consents, yes, it can. So you're in a non-complying space or discretionary in most cases. So you're not restricted in terms of what you can look at, as long as it is an effect of the proposal that you're assessing. In the Hauraki Gulf Islands, if you are within the restricted discretionary matters, then you are just restricted to those two items of discretion, which is noise effects and also any visual effects associated with physical works. So if you're a restricted discretionary activity under the HGI plan, no, some of those effects can't be considered for. But if you're a discretionary activity, you can within the HGI plan.
Okay, that's probably a nice segue to something that's popped up. Before I carry on with the questions, and I'll go to Mayor Goff, who has got a question, but I'll invite the Mayor to reflect on some correspondence that he and I received from the Minister for the Environment, whose antenna was obviously up on the issue of helicopters, and he wrote to the Mayor and I expressing an interest in how the reform of the RMA under the Natural and Built Environments Act and Strategic Planning Act might address some of these issues. So we received this correspondence just 3 weeks ago, Mayor, and and you and I replied yesterday. Mayor, I might just pass to you to cover off that letter to let the committee, bring the committee up to pace of the Minister's interest, and then your question as well. Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we received a letter from the Minister for the Environment, David Parker, around the time that this committee was due to first consider the issue of helicopters. And in essence, what he asks of the chair of the committee and myself is what are our views on there being specific matters on the topic of helicopters that merit consideration as part of the current reforms that he is undertaking. And after advice from staff, Chair Darby and myself replied, and in essence, we said that our ability to consider the effects of helicopter movements under the RMA are pretty much limited to takeoff and landing at present, and they don't include the impact of overflying, which comes under the Civil Aviation Act. And we thought that there were limited scope in the provisions of the Civil Aviation Act to address the general amenity effects, noise consideration, applying only to airports. So in essence, what we've pointed out to the Minister is a jurisdictional and legislative gap between the RMA and the Civil Aviation Act, with neither having the scope to address the general nuisance from helicopter overflying. We also pointed out that the tendency of the RMA Act reforms seem to be to remove consideration of amenity and not to focus on effects. So there's a real danger that the RMA reforms wanting to lessen controls could well mean that we had less ability to deal with the nuisance effects of helicopter overflying. I think that's a fair summary, Mr. Chair, of the correspondence. My question is this, and trying to avoid getting buried into the detail and the complexity of the issue. My question, I suppose, to Warren is what the report back to the planning committee from officers after you've assessed data is trying to achieve. And just an explanation of that question, I guess I'm looking at it in a fairly simple, but I hope not simplistic manner, that what we're actually considering here is a clash of interests. The convenience of those that want to use helicopters to get around, and the impact of their use of those helicopters on the rest of the population in terms of the noise and the disruption to the quiet enjoyment of life. That's the clash of interests. And what I'm hoping you'll come back to the committee with is not simply the data said this, this and this, but an assessment of whether we have got the balance of interests right at present and whether the process is adequate to the task. Is that what you're going to come back to us on? Because that's the sort of thing that I think is driving the concerns of those that have drawn our attention to this issue.
Warren.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, I think you've pretty much hit the nail on that one. Really looking at what the patterns of helicopter activity are like within the Auckland region, what effects they have, and what are the options that we can come up with to deal with those, which may be a plan change.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that just, there's a lot of complexity around it, but that cuts to the chase and says that's what we want to know. Is the balance right? The balance of rights and the process to ensure that the balance of rights is correct and that all viewpoints can be considered.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah.
Councillor Cooper, your question.
Thank you. My question was just around the call to just sort of add things in as an interim. And I think Brad was saying they got legal advice. Can you just confirm that that legal advice is that would be ultra vires to add things in without a proper plan change?
Might just go back to you, Warren, on the question of adding things in. I don't think I'm hearing at this stage we can add things into the assessment criteria. I think we're making the practice and guidance note is clarifying
Understand, it was just a call from one of the members of the committee to add some things in the interim to hold things over, and I just want to be really clear that it's illegal to do that. We can't just add things in without a proper process, plan change process and public consultation.
Look, I don't think Member Karen Wilson was speaking of adding things in that regard. Member Wilson was looking to...
Don't need clarification on that. I just want to be
to
clear
amend
for the public.
the recommendations. She was looking to add things into the recommendation, and Member Wilson is in contact with our staff right now.
Yeah, that's not how I heard it, but thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. Okay. Councillor Newman, your call.
Well, Chair, thank you very much. Warren, I guess the Mayor has actually hit the nail on the head. I have no idea why this discussion is being considered as a planning and resource management issue when it seems to me that the narrowness of the Civil Aviation Act is the problem here, and that the scope of reform required is not via a plan change from Auckland Council. It is a regulatory matter relating to safety and the efficiency of the transport network, which starts with civil aviation, and therefore it's the Civil Aviation Act that's narrow. The Act was written over 30 years ago when these sorts of problems weren't prevalent, but now they are. I understand that the Minister for Civil Aviation is probably Michael Wood or an Associate Minister under delegation. Very happy for letters to be exchanged with the Minister for the Environment, but shouldn't the matter be taken up with the appropriate minister and addressed as a safety matter under the CAA as opposed to an effects-based debate under the RMA?
Warren, with you.
So there are two parts, I think, to that. Firstly, you're raising safety issues, which, as you say, is quite properly the consideration of the Civil Aviation Authority. But secondly, you're also, under the RMA, we have to process resource consents for helipads as an activity. And so that's where we are looking primarily at the effect of the helicopter landing or taking off within the period of simply landing and taking off. That becomes an RMA issue. So that's where we've got these two pieces of legislation not quite melding. So there could well be some recommendations out of this to discuss further with the civil aviation.
But you wouldn't be able to consider safety issues as a consideration around restricted discretionary or non-complying activity under the RMA, because it would obviously sit under a different statute. Therefore, you can consider this, I presume, in terms of effects, notwithstanding that there is a safety risk, but you're limited under your consideration by effects only. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. The next call, no, I think we've taken the question of the Mayor, and are there any other questions on this, members? Warren, just before we conclude the questions, one last one of myself. You've given me a copy. I raised a question of you offline about the controlled air corridors, and you've given me a plan. The balance of the members can't see this because it's just come in this morning, but the yellow on that plan is controlled air corridor, is it? And there's a requirement to activate transponders within that area?
I could perhaps get Adrian to discuss that map, that email. Are you there, Adrian? Otherwise, I'll have a stab at it.
I think Adrian is in the room, unbeknownst to me, but kia ora. Adrian?
Well.
Kia ora, Chair. Warren, yeah, I can address that. There's we've been discussing with Civil Aviation about transponders, and there were some points made by a local board previously in relation to transponders being turned off when they go onto Waiheke, and therefore they can't identify the aircraft that are coming in. There's actually no legal requirement for the transponders to be on when it's in uncontrolled airspace. The map that Warren's referring to is very confusing, but basically it shows different heights in which is controlled airspace. Most of that starts at around 1,500 feet. Helicopters coming from Auckland going across to Waiheke would probably not reach that height. And most of Waiheke is actually above 1,500. It's up to 2,500 feet. So helicopters going in without transponders don't actually commit any breach in relation to Civil Aviation Authority rules. However, it doesn't mean that they're not tracked. So their radar signals and records are still in play. It's just it's very difficult to see which particular helicopter it was and what call sign it was. But we're working with the Civil Aviation Authority to actually look back historically, and we can actually see where those helicopters landed and where they took off from their radar track, even if we don't know the specific helicopter itself.
Okay, and that's the work you've got. You've got some of that work underway at the moment, and it's progressing, and we'll hear more of that. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. That's the questions. Now, these motions are moved and seconded. Now, I just need to go back to Member Wilson, and Member Wilson has been working with the staff, and thank you, Member Wilson. And the proposal is to add an additional, well, it's a J, and the words are as on the screen. Note that as a matter of priority, council staff will consider options for providing interim protection measures from helicopter activity for sites of significance to mana whenua on Aotea Great Barrier. Now that is added. I want to go to either Warren or John Dogood. I'll go to the General Manager of Plans and Places, John Dogood, to address that particular addition, please.
Thank you, Chair. So probably responding to Councillor Cooper's concerns, the suggestion here isn't that there's necessarily much we can do under the current rules in the Unitary Plan. But look, there may be something we can do before I is progressed, because the work on the sites and places of significance to mana whenua takes quite a bit of time. It'll be probably quite a bit of time until additional sites are scheduled on Aotea Great Barrier. So there may be something we can do, possibly by way of a focused plan change. That's obviously has resource requirements, and we need the evidence for that. But I'm comfortable that we could look at some options that may provide that interim protection, because it does seem that there is a gap in the hierarchy of islands in terms of being able to look at cultural values. So acknowledge the IMSB's concerns.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Cooper, you're the seconder, and you did just raise a question.
Aren't I the seconder? Pippa.
Oh, sorry, Pippa. My apologies, Councillor Coombe. We're all good, but I do need to just go to Councillor Cooper as the Chair of Regulatory, because Councillor Cooper did raise a question about this before. I just want to check.
No, I had my question.
Okay, you're fine with that. Good. So the motions are before us, moved and seconded, and apologies, Councillor Coombe, you definitely are the seconder. Any discussion on this, members? Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And I do want to support our regulatory staff in the fact that they're working within a framework, a legal framework, which they have to work. They can't just make stuff up. And the difficulty with all of these sorts of plans we have is there's often a perception of what we can deal with in the regulatory space and the reality. And it's really clear that our regulatory staff can't deal with the noise in the sky, because that is the Civil Aviation Authority. But often probably what the issues are the noise in the sky. And so I think we've got to be very realistic. The other thing around this is, as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, there's some really significant planning work that has to be done at the moment. And I would say, I know that it affects some people and upsets some people, but the reality here is we've got tree protection plan changes, which is absolutely significant for people right across the region that we're working in, the density and character issues we've got to deal with. We've got to have our staff working on those. Those are really critical. This piece of work, I think, is where we need to go, is to really pulling apart all the moving parts, because it's very complex. This is very complex. And we clearly can't look at cultural issues at the moment, and we can't look at amenity. We can only look at visual and oral, and, you know, we are restricted to those. And I think that is a common misconception, that restricted means what are we going to restrict? It's actually that the issues that can be looked at are restricted under the RMA, and until there's a change to that law, it makes it very difficult. And I acknowledge that there's issues here, but I also want to support the fact that we can't go to court with this, because the people that would oppose us making this prohibited have got very deep pockets. Because basically this is for people that have got a lot of money, and they will fight to the ends of earth for their right to do what they want to do. You know, and that's their right under the law. So we've got to be really clear that with the resources we've got to use them really wisely. And we only challenge things in court that we can feel like we can really win. And that use of that public money going to court has a really good outcome. So I support these recommendations and find out where we can get to here in an ultimate plan change. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. I'll now go to the second of, and the speaking of, to this from Councillor Coombe, please.
Thanks, Chair. I would like to speak in support, and in doing so, excuse me, acknowledge the Waiheke Local Board and the Aotea Great Barrier Local Board chairs, and Alex Bonham from the Waitemata Local Board, who've been doing a really deep dive into this issue alongside Quiet Sky Waiheke and the Herne Bay Residents Association, who've done a huge amount of work behind the scenes in terms of the whole framework and the regulation of helicopters. And it is a lot of different moving parts. Totally appreciate that. And in terms of what council can do, I think this is good to see that the work is underway. So today we're really just confirming work that already started last month. So, excuse me, I do want to thank the teams, the staff that are involved who are progressing this work, particularly the investigation and the practice note that I think will assist a great deal. Of course, there are a whole range of effects, and yes, Chair, I do appreciate that those effects go beyond just noise. But what we are seeing is just a huge proliferation of applications that it was never envisaged when the Unitary Plan and the Hauraki Gulf Islands District Plan was put in place. And that proliferation is really causing a lot of anxiety and concerns. And say on Aotea Great Barrier, they've never had applications before, and suddenly there's been a whole lot coming through where perhaps applicants are seeing that this is just something to have on a property, to have a helipad, and they just want to anticipate that they can just add this to the value of their property rather than even having a current need. And of course on Waiheke we know that proliferation has now pushed helipads to over 50 on the island, and I don't think that was ever envisaged when the provisions were liberalised in a way to allow for tourism on the island, which was the original thinking. Also, just thinking of the mainland too, I mean, no one imagined that a homeowner would look to build a helipad on a historic boat shed, which is, you know, quite phenomenal that anyone would consider to have that would be okay to have helicopter movements coming in over a public beach. So I do appreciate there's a lot of things happening, a lot of impacts that we're now trying to deal with, and also sensitivities around increase in noise from a whole lot of things, but also that impact of noise on the amenity for residents, visitors, say on Waiheke, but also the impact across marine life. That's a whole new area that's being researched, and we're only just starting to understand that impact. So I'm just throwing together a lot of the concerns there that we are trying to tackle. And I think that these provisions and the resolutions that we're noting and the work that's underway do go to some way in terms of that investigation that needs to happen. And of course, I do appreciate the stretch of resources currently with staff, but it was good to hear that we can, that these steps are underway and we can look to have options come back to us at the end of the year. I also just wanted to note, members of the committee can't see it on the screen, but do have access to the resolutions that J has been deleted. And I know the advice from staff is that a declaratory judgment isn't needed, but I didn't think that we needed to agree today not to do something. It should just be all of the options on the table. So thank you, Chair, for agreeing to take that out. And finally, just to comment too, that support the addition. Thank you, Member Wilson, for working on that in terms of how we can take steps now to protect sites of significance to mana whenua on Aotea Great Barrier. And it's good that that work is underway too by the heritage team to identify and protect those sites. So another good bit of work that, has been needing to be progressed. And I think that excuse me, what we're doing today is encouraging and takes that forward. So I do commend this to members of the committee and provide my support. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Coombe, and thanks for your tremendous work on this and pulling the boards together into the discussion that we've had with our staff. It's been great. Members, I'm probably not on the Liberal side of providing it an easy road for locating helipads. I'm seeing a proliferation of helicopter activity across central Auckland, and we're hearing from our Waiheke community and our Aotea community and our Waitemata community these concerns. We do have to look at it, and I think the willingness of the staff, even considering their really busy program, to have a look at this. It does amaze me and astounds me sometimes when I look at, we've got bylaws in place which actually ban the housing of a rooster in your neighbourhood and all the noise that might generate. But it's a restricted discretionary activity under the RMA or a non-complying activity to put a helipad in, and all the noise and loss of amenity and intrusion on privacy that comes with that. So compare how we treat the rooster with the helipad applicant, we're poles apart. Look, I don't want to jump to any conclusions here. That's my personal view. We'll do the work, we'll do the analysis, and come months down the track, we'll see what options are presented to this committee. But I thank everybody for their work and contributions on this matter. And we will also our staff will also be following up with Ministry for the Environment officials in response to the interest of the Minister for the Environment, the Honourable David Parker. We'll leave it there and put it to the vote. The motions are moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 And to the contrary, no. And that matter is carried. Members, it is the time? 11:48. We're going to take